Sounding out materiality, archiving Foley sound. And this is the day that has sort of French references in the panel titles. The first one was interpolation, which of course refers to Althusser. Sounding out refers to something that Godard said in an interview with Michael Witt that was recently published as a wonderful little book, where Godard said that the cinema was an art of ausculter, of sounding out, which is a medical term. So it's not about looking, but about sort of listening and trying to hear and sound out things that are, as in the case of the doctor listening to the body, beyond the realm of the visible. And one area where sounds come into play in cinema in a sense that speaks to Godard's concept is indeed the art of Foley, named after a guy called Foley. But what it really means, well, our first panelist, Simone Nowicki, will explain it to us. Simone is a PhD candidate in the PhD program Configurations of Film at Goethe University in Frankfurt. But she's also a Foley artist, an accomplished Foley artist with a career in that field. So as a friend of mine recently observed regarding your project, in a way it's an autoethnography, your current PhD research. And our second panelists, because we have an important addition to the panel, come to us from Prague in the Czech Republic. Jonáš Kucharský is the curator of sound and music in the Národní film archive. He has a background in musicology, and we discussed this yesterday. The Národní is, I think, quite unique in that they did create the sound curatorship position, assigning somebody among their scientific staff to just work on sound and music, and that's actually quite unique and remarkable. So Jonas has held this position for 6 years now, as I just learned, and he'll be sharing the stage with Sara Pinheiro, who is a composer and musician, and they work together on a variety of projects. And the starting point for their presentation is the existence, verified existence, of a Foley archive in Barndorf Studios, and the challenge the preservation and tradition of that archive poses. So without further ado, Simone, please take the stage.
Yeah, good day, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you for having me here. I'm really starstruck on one hand, on the other side, I'm super excited to talk about sound, because that's really important for me, and sometimes I'm feeling singled out in my field. So it's a nice day to talk about Foley. Sound making or noise making in my project, I'm talking a lot about noise making. I know I'm in the context of Foley artistry, is for me far more than merely imitating sound. It is an art form based on intuition, technical skill. It has its kind of body language, if you can say so, and above all, a great deal of determination. For me, it is important to emphasize that noise making is about selling a sound to the audience, even when it doesn't exactly match the physical properties of the object's reality. The term noisemaker, in German it's Geräuschemacher, Geräuschemacherin, plays a central role here, as it distances itself from being associated with a single name like Jack Foley, and instead points to a broader, more diverse network cluster that existed even before the advent of sound films in 1927. And by creating my presentation and being a little bit awestruck by Susanna, I thought, okay, maybe I get a little bit more self-confidence and start to show my own work and to make my problem more clearly in this kind of field. I'm so sorry for the cringe. It's the best material I have right now about myself because I'm a live Foley artist. So for my presence is mostly also ephemeral, but on the other hand, the concert buildings are real and manifest themselves even when I'm gone away. Here I want to present you a part of my work. I had the opportunity to Foley and make the sounds for the first live-streamed gaming concert event, kind of like this hybrid thing at the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg this year, and it was kind of in collaboration with the Twitch streaming context, and also had a live viewership online of 100,000 people. So I just want to make clear that this is nothing normal for me, and it was kind of like this huge thing in my career. And then they made this 2-minute behind-the-scenes footage of myself. So,
Hi, ich bin Simone Nowicki und ich bin Geräuschemacherin, also ich bin für den Krach auf der Bühne verantwortlich. Ich habe vorne meinen Screen und je nachdem, was eben der Gamer jetzt auf der Bühne macht, darauf reagiere ich mit Geräuschen dazu. Also das ist alles sehr spontan und deshalb sehr aufregend. Beispielsweise Arbeitshandschuhe verwende ich eben gerne für alles, was eben flattert. Das ist eigentlich immer was Dankbares. Ich mache beispielsweise auch sehr gerne eine Ente mit so einer alten 80er-Jahre-Raspel. Da hat man auch immer so ein schönes Quietschen irgendwie so mit drin, weil alte Dinge quietschen natürlich immer ein bisschen besser als neue.
Okay, 3, 2, 1 und Abflug.
Ich finde eigentlich spannend, dass man Materialien dabei hat, die auch ZuschauerInnen zu Hause haben, dass man die vielleicht in anderen Kontexten wiederentdeckt. Dadurch, dass wir 2 Spiele spielen, das eine ist eben in einer Waldthematik, das andere befindet sich eigentlich die ganze Zeit im Schnee, muss ich mir überlegen, okay, wie vertone ich diese namenlose Figur, dass man manchmal solche Cues einfach hat, dass die sich bewegt. Und ich muss sagen, ich mag, das ist eigentlich ganz simpel, das ist so ein kleiner Becher, der innen drin noch so ein kleines Glöckchen hat. Und das ist, glaube ich, ganz zentral. Also immer, wenn man was erspielt oder wenn Stay jetzt vielleicht einen neuen Cue hat, eine neue Ebene erreicht oder sowas, ist es spannend, wie Signalgeräusche gerade funktionieren. Und dann, was nochmal bei Journey ganz besonders ist natürlich, und das werden auch alle wissen, die es schon mal gespielt haben, ist einfach der Wind. Also es ist dieser schneidende Wind und den mache ich eigentlich mit einer, das nennt man mexikanische Totenpfeife, die verwende ich anders, indem ich sie eigentlich falsch spiele, indem ich die Hand vorne dran halte und die macht dann eigentlich ein cooles Windgeräusch. Also wie man Geräuschemacherin wird, ist eine gute Frage. Ich habe mich eigentlich schon immer mit Sound beschäftigt und fand das toll und wie man sieht, habe eine ziemlich große Sammelleidenschaft von allem, was rumpelt und bin dann eigentlich über meine eigene Live-Hörspielgruppe Minenspiel bin ich eigentlich dazu gekommen, Geräusche zu machen, auf der Bühne vor allem. Und das mache ich jetzt seit 10 Jahren, aber das war eigentlich auch nur ein glücklicher Zufall, mit dem ich vor 10 Jahren auch nicht gerechnet habe, dass ich mal hier spielen darf. Also ich glaube, Geräuschemacherin wird man, indem man sich viel damit auseinandersetzt und Glück hat und dann an den richtigen Orten mal spielt oder dabei ist.
I think it's why I'm showing this material is on the one hand to show you how cool I am. On the other hand, no, I thought about it. Oh, it's so cringy. But on the other hand, I want to show what my problem here is and why sometimes I can't sleep at night, because right now here my work is archived as well in this digital space. And I hate this question in talking about Foley, about how I become a Foley artist myself, because then I reveal that I have no idea. And this is kind of a huge problem in the field, and also serves as a starting point in my research about Foley artistry, is when you're asked about it, you're kind of speaking to a huge audience who gets to notice you the first time, and then you have this one chance to say something about it, and you're also not clear about why are you even here. And for me, this is kind of like this touching point between feeling like an amateur in a space where you're invited to and also are not sure why you as a person are invited right now, and then being archived as this artist and also with your definition about Foley artistry. So I started reading again the Foley Grail, one of the few practical books on the subject of Foley artistry from the USA, and was surprised how little information is actually found in it. Rick Altman wrote the foreword, and already in the introduction I came across a quote that practically buries the entire historical discourse about sound making. So here it says, when one chooses to research of the beginnings of the crafts now referred to as Foley, several things become apparent. First, it becomes obvious that there are many myths and inaccurates floating around that contribute to the mystery and misunderstanding of the origins and development of Foley. And then this sentence happens. Second, the practitioners of the craft are very busy doing their jobs and have precious little time to document the history of how their craft came to be or how they approached their work itself. And then later on, and finally, those who study and report open the craft and origins of Foley or any aspect of film sound who are not from the culture, view this world from a different lens, thus have different observations than those who have lived it. So I think it's kind of apparent that there's an issue in the self-definition of Foley artistry by the practitioners themselves and the people who are allowed to speak about what Foley is. And that makes it kind of like too easy for it to talk about it. The desire to replicate sounds has existed for a long time, whether in the theater of ancient Greece or the appearance of a thunder god in the Baroque era. Visual entertainment has always required an auditory dimension. For example, in the time of Mozart, a device called the Bronteon, sounds like a cool dinosaur, was used in the stagecraft to create thunder sounds. The first written record of sound makers can be traced back to a Berlin magazine called Der Artist in 1896. And at the same time, the Skladandowski brothers were showing their first silent films in 1895, and Louis Lumière was demonstrating his cinematograph at the Indian Salon of the Grand Café in Paris. Madame Olenka's husband was synchronizing animal sounds during a cinematographic performance. It was reported that Mr. Hubertus, Madame Olenka's husband, was an excellent imitator of animal sounds, bringing the individual pictures to life with invisible noises and sounds. Technological developments and the rise of Jack Foley bring a different dimension in how we talk about something. We are talking about, okay, 1927, there's this contribution to this new field and kind of like, okay, synchronized sound we know today. But I want to show some different names which run around. If you try to find something about Foley craftsmanship, you have to look a little bit deeper or find other and different names for it. Because of time, I brought one example I'm working currently about. It's about the pea shakers and effect boys. By the late 19th century, effect boys were hired to produce sound effects live. These men used everyday objects like car horns and boxes filled with peas to immerse audiences in the world of performances. Despite their crucial role, the craft was not recognized as a profession. There was neither formal training nor fair compensation. This kind of, relates to me a lot. The term Percy Pea Shakers, coined by critic Louis Reeves Harrison, reflects the devaluation of these sound makers, whose work was seen as uncreative and crude. And I have an example here in a US paper. He writes about Percy. It's just like, kind of like the name Hans Guck in die Luft. It's just this one name to talk to a collective. When there's water in the picture, it goes to Percy's cerebrum. If there's a lake shown on the screen, no matter if it's a mile away, calm or stormy, he shakes his box of peace so that we may know that it's principally made of water. Realism becomes intense when a vessel appears, and Percy blows a whistle, whoop whoop, to enforce the fact that it's a steamer and not a full-rigged ship. Bow wow indicates that we are looking at a dog and not a doormat. This negative connotation reflects the low regard sound makers were held in during the early 20th century, despite their indispensable contribution to the cinematic experience. And sometimes I have the problem when we're talking about the 1920s, we're talking about, okay, the invention of sound effects, but for me it's, okay, what is the working cluster around it? But maybe we talk later on about it. So we have this technological developments and the rise of Jack Foley. With the advent of sound films and the development of technical devices such as the Aleflex machine, the world of sound making began to change. Jack Foley, often considered the father of modern sound making, made the revolutionary suggestion of producing sounds live while the film was being played. This synchrony between image and sound added a new dimension to film. But despite Foley's central role, the term Foley artist remains problematic for me, as it reduces the craft to one person and overlooks the collaborative nature of the work, as well as the historical predecessors of the professions. The creative and artistic contribution of women, for example, in this field in particular, have often been overlooked, as the profession has historically been male-dominated. And for me, a huge help was the work of Melanie Bell in her work, Learning How to Listen. Here she writes that the development of sound making has long been shaped by male-dominated structures. Women working in this field were often overlooked, their contribution marginalized. In a male-dominated film industry, female sound makers rarely had the opportunity to make a name for themselves. And this is where the research of film historian Melanie Bell comes into play, focusing on the role of women in British film industry, particularly on the little-known Beryl Mortimer, one of the first female sound makers or noise makers. And Beryl Mortimer was a prominent figure in the sound-making scene of the 1950s and 1960s. If you listen to Lawrence of Arabia, if you're listening to Kubrick movies, if you're listening to James Bond movies, you can hear Beryl's work. But she's not recognized till shortly before her death, and it's just called Beryl the Boot because she was so good in stepping, and we are left just without her name in the history and just Jack Foley's name. Her creative and technical expertise contributed significantly to the atmosphere of numerous films, but I have to say, Jack Foley is also not so recognized in the field. We have to talk about Foley artistry also being marginalized, but in this intersectionality, we can see a difference by one person having a name and the others are just collective of noisemakers. Just with my last 5 minutes, I want just to make a nice step to the present and my problem and what it means. And to talk about body knowledge and body language. Body knowledge is, in the context of Foley artistry, refers to the embodiment skills and understanding that Foley artists possess, which allows them to recreate the sounds of characters and actions in film. This includes the ability to mimic the sounds of various movements, such as footsteps, clothing noises, and the interaction with props by using their own bodies and specialized tools. Foley artists must have a deep understanding how different body types and movements produce sounds and how they often need to move around in this field. But however, while these embodied skills are crucial, the decades of knowledge that have been accumulated are now at risk of being lost. Traditional master-apprentice relationships, which have been a key part of how the craft is passed down, are severely impacted by the industrial cutbacks. There are fewer formal training structures, and new artists have less access to the old techniques and tricks that define this craft. And I have this quote about Jörg Klinkenberg, and he's one of the most prominent live Foleys in Germany. And he's talking, okay, he's often asked to have this apprentice, but he has no money for it because the work is cut down, that it can't happen that he can pay someone else for it. This loss of traditional knowledge poses a significant threat to the future of Foley artistry, as the unique skills that have been honed over the years could disappear without the necessary structures to preserve and pass them on to the next operation. So how are we dealing with it right now in the present? In the landscape of contemporary Foley artistry, the online platform Foley Artists EU emerges as a pivotal hub, not only for information about this craftsmanship, but also focusing a vibrant community of European practitioners, where right now they are forming their own network about knowledge. By highlighting the artistry behind the soundscapes of film, television, and games, Foley Artists EU underscores how Foley contributes to emotional depth, narrative realism, and the overall audience immersion. And I just want to show you something, because it's a question, for whom is this website? And if you're looking at, is it okay to switch just shortly? It's okay. If you're looking here at this website, we are 30 Foleys. The website is not so nice, but it's a beginning. It's about, okay, what is important right now to archive? It's kind of like the utopia, how we like to get paid. We have this Foley Mart, and it's about, okay, if we have a 90-minute films, and we discuss the frequency of cutting, is there sound post-production? Yes. How many actors are here in one scene? Maybe 5. The genre, animation, cinema, or TV prime time, and then animals. Yes. And then it's about talking about the Foley recording days. This is not happening. This is not the industry, but it's kind of like, okay, the definition, what is utopia, and what is the aim of work if we come connected together, what we would like to be paid. It's a utopian idea, but it's also kind of nice to show how much it takes to work for it. And then afterwards, if I'm coming in as a live Foley, I have a different setting in it. So we are not unionized yet, but sometimes it's good to show how much work is in one scene or in 90-minute movie sets. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. I feel really honored and lucky to be continuing with this. So in the next 20 minutes, I will try to tell you a bit about the history of the Foley Archive, which is a now defunct institution that was founded at the Barrandov Film Studios, the major film studios in Prague. And the second half of the presentation is going to be focused on a composition that Sara Pinheiro did for this year's Archival Assembly for the Listening Bar. Thursday, was it playing? I think. I don't remember anymore. Yeah, so this is the title. So during the past couple of days, we've all been being more familiar with the context of sound in film, and we've heard for a couple of times the term hegemony or hegemony of the visual, meaning how this take on cinema or history of cinema has been always dominated by the vision, not the sound really. But as we've been discussing during the panels with loads of you, with colleagues, it's kind of contradictory as well, because the famous Michel Chion thought experiments about removing sound from image, etc., are almost 40 years old now. So we should all be maybe thinking about the sound being a part of film history more and more, and actually saying that this field has been established already, which it sort of is, but sort of isn't, which is the case with this collection as well. We at the National Film Archive have been trying to pay more attention to film sound, both in terms of research, restoration, but also in terms of the materials themselves. Originally, our policy, or the way we do things, is that we take care primarily of the final materials, meaning negatives, distribution prints, etc. And with film material or film sound materials, the story of how they were created and what actually is the final material is sort of a complex question, and the answer to the question, what is the final material, always depends on the historical context and the technological context in which the film was produced. In the context of Czechoslovakia or Czech film, we can talk about the advent of magnetic sound, meaning magnetic materials and the recording technology being used in film production ever since the mid-50s, let's say. History says that the first film that was produced solely on magnetic materials, up until the last point of printing, the actual print, was produced in 1958 or 9, I don't remember anymore. It's called Vesnická učitelka. Doesn't really matter that much, but it just shows that ever since the late 50s, magnetic workflow was the standard for film sound production in Czechoslovakia, which in itself poses a very complex problem, because first of all, for many, many years, the film history or film technology history in Czech Republic has thought that the materials are long gone, basically because they were never really viewed as the final material or archival material. And also because the main properties of magnetic sound, which mean that you can re-record the sound. It's not final. You can use the tapes again and again and again. But we have, in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, made some discoveries. And from the starting point where we thought, oh, okay, most of the magnetic tapes are gone, maybe there are a couple of hundreds, we are now facing this situation where it's thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of boxes of some sounds. So this is just a picture how to illustrate the magnitude of the potential materials. So we are trying to devise a system and a methodology of how to take care of these materials, both in their physical form, which is not really possible, to be honest. It's very complicated with magnetic carriers, but most importantly, their content themselves. What's complicated with film sound or sound in general is the question of identification of the sound. So imagine you have a box that carries a title of a film and it tells you, okay, this is a Foley recording or Foley mix. But then you have like 8 reels of random sounds, noises, steps, winds, whatever. And it's very hard for a human ear to actually figure out if the content actually belongs to the film, which was also kind of shown in our project with Sara that we will talk about. So you have this issue of having a huge quantity of material that you have to somehow catalog before actually listening to it to just make the basic overview of what sort of material you have, and then you go into digitizing them and trying to identify them. And with different types of tapes and different types of contents, it becomes more and more complicated. So the studios or the tapes that we have found the tapes at are listed here, the Barrandov studios, Lean studios. It doesn't really matter that much now. It just goes to show that the magnetic workflow was very prominent ever since, say, early 60s. There was obviously this brief window in which not only Czechoslovak, but the world cinema kind of thought that the magnetic technology is going to be the king also for distribution with the CinemaScope technology, which means print. In terms of sound, it means a print with a ferromagnetic layer being put on around the perforation, but the production costs of the materials were so high that only hundreds or thousands of films titles were produced in this way in the world, in the context of world cinema. In terms of typology of the production materials or the materials that were used during film sound production, we can always talk about the carriers themselves, meaning different formats. Magnetic tape in this context doesn't mean only the open reel players or tapes that we all know, but also perforated, what we call SEPMAGs, separate magnetic materials. These are various formats. Again, it's not that important now. It only goes to show that there is a huge heterogeneity, both in terms of the formats themselves, but then the contents, which is more important here. Because during the process of film sound production, all the sounds would be recorded on smaller format media, meaning 1/4 inch or inch tapes, and then during each step of the mix, they would be printed or re-recorded through a different material. So if you, in theory, if you had the whole process preserved for one particular film, whereas in picture it would be, let's say, 8 reels or 9 reels of film, depends on the length, obviously, but with sound you would be dealing with hundreds and hundreds of boxes. because you would be dealing with Foley tapes, dialogue tapes, music tapes, but then mixes of those tapes, pre-mixes, stems of that for mixes, and then the masters, which are the final mixes. But then from the masters, you would actually create dubbing tapes, meaning tapes that contain separated tracks for dubbing. Which kind of brings us to the Foley archive itself, because this technology of magnetic sound allowed more convenient and technologically safe and storage of materials, of the contents. And from our historical research, we know that the Barrandov Film Studios have been trying to establish such an institution, a sound bank, Foley archive, whatever you want to call it, ever since early 50s. There were some attempts to do with optical tracks in early 50s. It was probably successful. We know that from oral history projects we did, but we haven't found any material traces of that. Then in late 50s, there was this working group that was trying to create a magnetic Foley archive. From anecdotal reports from late 50s, early 60s, we know that the Foley archive probably did exist back then, but when we did the oral history projects, meaning talking with the engineers or catalogers that were actually part of the archive itself, everybody was adamant that the archive was established in 1968. So even the history of the start of this institution is quite complicated, and it looks like there might have been at least 3 Foley archives happening around the same time in the Barrandov Film Studios. But what we know for certain is that from 68 to 89, 90, there was this Foley archive, which was the way it worked was if you produced a film in Barrandov Film Studios, and mind you, this was during the communist period, meaning the state had the capital, the hegemony, the sole production power in the state, so most of the feature films were actually produced at Barrandov Film Studios, and those films, if they created Foley tracks, they were obliged to store the tracks in this archive. Meaning in the first couple of months or years, the archive actually gathered thousands and thousands of kilometers of tape. And what we also know from interviews with sound engineers, it became really, really clear really quickly that this whole archive brings the costs of film production much, much lower than if you had to actually re-record or the Foley. So it was very common practice for the sound engineers to actually not to record Foley, but to go to the archive, because they had a very specific cataloging system that would allow you to search by keywords, and you would be able to find whatever you please. Which then means if you had this sort of archive, and all the films were using sort of the same collection, it's highly possible that, for example, steps you might hear in a classic Czechoslovak New Wave film from '68 might be also present in some later comedy from the '80s, which is quite an exciting idea, I think. We've been trying to reconstruct this Foley archive because, as I've said, it's sadly lost and gone now, or the materials themselves, or so we thought. We've been doing this project on digitizing the production tape, the dubbing tape, and I don't want to go into the technical details, but when you have the dubbing tape, what you do have is the sort of final mix of Foley separated in a track, because it's served for new language version film production, which in theory then means, if you know that the film was produced at Barrandov State Studios and the film was actually using this archive, then you can probably recreate what the contents of the archive from the Foley tracks, from the dubbing tapes, from the particular films themselves, which is maybe it might be a bit of a stretch, but then again, not really, because we know that everybody was using the archive and everybody was obliged to store the tracks in the archive, which is more important maybe. So we've been trying to reconstruct this with our project of digitization, identification of the tapes. And this is where Sara comes in, but before she comes in, I just have to be really honest, and that we've been doing this project for a while, but quite recently, last year, we have actually found the archive, not really the archive itself, but one sound engineer who worked at Barrandov Studios ever since the 60s, and after a couple of interviews and a couple of long interviews, he actually revealed that he has this hard drive. Guess what the content was. The sad part is that the digitization or transfer of the materials was done in the late O years or early O years, late 90s. So the technical standard is not great. It's CD quality, WAV files. It's around 10,000 files, or maybe a bit more. The recordings themselves range from 5 seconds to 10 minutes. There are around 8,000 unique keywords in the system. Sadly, the catalog itself is lost. We only have sort of a list of the contents of the tapes, not the cataloging system itself, meaning the keywords and the hierarchy of the keywords, etc. But still, we have at least something to work with, and it's around 250 hours of recordings, which poses in itself a huge question how to identify this, how to catalog this. This is a project for another day and a talk for another day as well. But what we are able to do now is to actually work with both the dubbing tape or the production materials we have present for a huge part of Czech cinema, and actually compare them or work with the remains or what we have, the digital trace of the Foley archive itself. That's where Sara comes in, and I would like you to literally come in if possible. Welcome, Sara. Do you want a mic here or?
Yeah, maybe. I've seen one of these before. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Sara Pinheiro. I'm sorry, I have to say it. I'm not a musician. I'm a sound designer. I make sound for film, everything else but the music. And basically, I'm here today because Jonáš and I have been talking about this archive for very long. And of course, I was very curious to listen to the sounds and to put my hands on it, which I'm very grateful that he allowed me. But basically what we did, Jonáš selected 8 movies and gave me the dubbing tapes synchronized to the movies, which I muted the original film, the original sound, and the visuals. I didn't listen to it or looked at it, and I basically organized all the content from the dubbing tapes. It's very similar, for instance, to a Foley session, editing a Foley session. So the tracks, you know, how you divide the content based on materiality, or, you know, the sources. You have animals, you have human movement, you have footsteps, you have all sorts of things. In this case, of course, because it's the dubbing tapes, it means that it came together with other things such as ambiances, for instance, which of course is not common for Foley sessions. But basically what I did is that film by film I started dividing in categories of sounds the content of the tapes, trying to keep the focus on the common things among the different films, like where did they connect and where the content could be eventually similar. And also at the same time having this line of thought that, you know, sound is absolutely contextual, and an isolated sound, which I don't think it exists, but let's say, you know, the sound of cutlery, let's say, in isolation kind of reads a certain way, but as soon as you put some other sound, connected or not, the reading changes. So after I organized these, I think, around 12 hours of material that Jonáš shared, we basically had this plan to make a 30-minute composition, but respecting the raw material. So no processing, no any sort of manipulation besides, let's say, editing. So I edited it, and I was thinking, because, you know, it was specifically for this context of the listening bar, I was thinking, well, most likely, you know, people can come in at any time, and I kind of had, and all the sounds, especially because they are dubbing tapes, all the sounds were kind of attic, you know, like this, always something happening or nothing, right? Like it was kind of, you know, contrasting dynamics in that sense. So I was thinking, like, this kind of needs to work as a composition starting every second. Anyone entering at any point needs to be engaged and, you know, curious to figure out what they're listening to. So the original composition of 30 minutes is kind of, dynamic and active. And we had this idea to make those 30 minutes raw and, as I said, not processed, and then make 3 different versions based on these original 30 minutes that basically gave a different reading to the same material. So the second version of this composition is what we're calling fictitious. And basically, I used more sounds from the same 12 hours, but I tried to kind of frame it a little bit more as you usually do in a film, meaning I added more ambiances, I added more relatable sounds. The moment that you have a dog barking, there is already a specific reading to the situation that doesn't happen without the dog barking. So the second version is, let's say, more relatable and more in line with the structure that we usually take to build the soundtrack of a film, or the integrated soundtrack of a film. Then the third version is, and it's probably also a take from my own research and my interest. I've been working for 15 years, I've been working in the intersection between acousmatic music and sound design for film, which, to put these 2 words together, I call acousmatic Foley. So the third version, being that all this process was acousmatic, the third version is in line with, a taste for concrete music, let's say, in which you start focusing on the spectral content of the sound, on the patterns that these samples can build, on filtering a specific part of the frequencies, so you have a different experience of the same sources. And then the fourth version, finally, we basically unmuted the films, the original synchronized version of the film. And although for me, because in my individual work, I never work with voice, and I never work with musical instruments. That's why I had to do the disclaimer first. And, to be very honest, very frank, that was the version that I was the least interested in terms of, maybe some sort of purity of sounds. And it was actually the one that caught me by surprise the most, because, I edited footsteps together with cutlery between 3 different films, right? And suddenly, by putting those things together, there's a sequence between these 3 films, in dialogue, in the music, in the dramaturgy, that either aligns or not, or doesn't align, either contrasts or is consonant, but it really shows the intrinsic quality of sound potential to produce fiction, to make the fiction for the audience, which eventually is something that interests me very much. So there's these 4 different versions of the same composition. The 12 hours of material became 30 minutes of a sequence that could have 300 different versions. I did everything very manually, meaning there was not like an automated way to process this information. I found some common aspects between these 8 movies that range from late 60s to early 80s. I think there's one from 81.
Yep.
And, it's a work in progress idea that we keep on trying to pick our brains to figure out how to deal with so much material and how to make sense of it. My interest is in these, qualities of sound as a fiction making tool, and at the same time trying to, look at Czech cinema, whose sound history is very valuable. I'm not Czech. I moved to Czech Republic because of the film context. So, I'm gladly engaged in this. But so looking at these films and trying to find, a specific Czech aesthetic to the sound design, related also, of course, to technology and to the period of this archive. and I think I covered everything.
Yeah, I just have a closing remark that there is hopefully many things to come in the future from this archive. I don't want to jinx anything, but maybe we can touch on that in the Q&A. And just regarding the specificity of the Czech film sound, given the fact that the Foley archive was theoretically used for all the films produced from '68, I think we have, or Sara has succeeded with this, because there was one listener that came to the listening session and she said that all of a sudden she didn't read anything about the program. She isn't part of the conference, and she just came in and she's like, this is Czech film, I know this. This is actually, it sounds like Schwankmajer, definitely Schwankmajer, even though it wasn't Schwankmajer.
It was Footsteps in Czech, basically.
Yeah. So that's the unofficial title of this paper, Footsteps in Czech. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, I switched it back and forth. Keep us in it. Can you stay here?
All right, thanks for two very inspiring and wonderfully complimentary papers. I just want to start off by letting everyone here know, and tell it to your friends and everyone, relatives with or without PhDs, that all of the soundbar recordings are going to be put online at the Arsenal website, right? Yes. So in case you missed the Czech footsteps, there's a chance to catch up with them and listen to them. Let me start out with something that I was thinking about listening to both of your presentations. A face on film cannot be substituted, which is part of the reason why stars get paid so well, because there's nobody who looks like them. Sounds are substitutable, obviously, and you can even substitute one sound source for another, which we learned from your short video, where rubber gloves can stand in for the flight of a bird. And so sounds can be substituted, they can be repeated, and in a way sound, let me put it probably a bit too succinctly, but sound is always already an archive. It's always already an archive, or it's always already archival, because it is generic, and if you have recorded sound, you can use it in various contexts, which is what you're saying. And so that's a very specific, or something of a specificity of it. So maybe you can tell us something about that in relation to maybe, Sara, with your creative practice, and also Simone with your creative practice. Where's the novelty of sound, quite simply?
Where's the novelty of sound? What an exciting question. For me, it's kind of like, in my work, I like to trace my own novelty, for example, in my own noise cellar, in my objects. These are kind of like things I collected from, for example, my grandparents, or what I found. It's kind of like my own object archive. And when I'm using it, or for example, I'm really interested in this whole TikTok and how you show your work. And when I'm using it, I'm showing it and selling it as something like, of course, rubber gloves are ducks, for example, and then I historicize it in a kind of way, in putting myself into it. The problem with it in thinking about object archives is that these are defined by the Foley artists themselves, and if the Foley is gone, it becomes again back kind of like gloves again, or different instruments you put on the Sperrmüll if the Foley disease. For me, it's kind of like the question in novelty, what working cluster I'm dealing it, what is my network in it. I also use my own sound database, we're all using it, but who were the persons before me using it, and what is there a copyright to Foley as well? That's a question I really have, and maybe we could talk about it. But I really loved your idea, and first I want to characterize all the sounds and orchestra it by myself, because that's how Foley is. You orchestra your own objects, and then that's the first work you do, and then later you present it. And yeah,
it was also a way to get acquainted with the material, because we were, like listening to 12 hours of dubbing tapes. Just listening would not, engage me with the material. So like this, I could deal with it. But to relate to your answer, and also something that you said yesterday here, the reason why Foley art is still one of the most analog ways to achieve result efficiently is because actually a sound, there's not a sound that is simple a sound. A footstep is, a footstep can be 5 different things. So when you look at the scene and you need to realize not only the kind of shoe, the kind of floor, the kind of body that is walking, how that body is walking, is it angry walking, and I'm not joking now, like angry walking, happy walking. There's a film, it's Gus Van Sant, Jerry, I think it's called, that, basically the whole sound design is just footsteps. And if you take the image away and you listen to the arc in the footsteps, you can actually say in which dramatic moment of the story they are. But, so, sorry, I lost myself a little bit. But basically, the novelty is, in the sense also, when you listen to these only 8 films out of an enormous archive, and you hear the nuances of what comes together with the fact that it is footsteps, what comes together with cutlery, and me listening to the film straight from beginning till the end without looking at the image, you're still able to say if it is, they must be really having fun now because the cutlery is happening this way or that way. So I'm sorry, but I actually don't agree that faces are irreplaceable and sounds are replaceable. The reason, and also again it comes with the context, because a glove, a rubber glove in itself is a rubber glove, but the moment that you attach it to the image, these 2 things become a third thing, which, it's what Shion calls audiovisual contract and this kind of like visual resonance. But, so yeah, I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Yeah. And also, I'm sorry, I just want to say this, because yesterday we were talking and, your participation, and someone was saying about like how sound, and Jonas already tackled that, but how sound somehow seems to be neglected, which I don't think has been for the last, let's say, 30 years. But one of the first things that students, for instance, when they go study film, have to understand is, of course, we know there has been a camera shooting the film for us, and somehow we used to think that the sound just came with it. And now I think there's more awareness that, no, it's 2 different apparatus putting things together. It's not, we usually take sound for granted, and it's not. So yeah, sorry.
And just to connect with it, it's about, I liked yesterday the discussion about morality and how you use craftsmanship in kind of like a moral way. And if you're talking to young film scholars, it's about, okay, it takes time. It takes time to organize something. It takes time to collect something. It takes time to know that this is an instrument. It's the third thing. And on Wednesday we were talking about Lumen, I think, about, okay, form and format. It's about, okay, a Foley gives something a form. And this is something really important, and this takes time, and it's important to talk about today, if we're talking about AI, what is the history of it and what we are losing, because we don't know what we are losing because the history is not right there in film scholarly.
I mean, picking up from what you said, Sara, of course, I mean, the connection, once you start relating sounds to images, you create something new. I mean, that's part of what the novelty of sound is. But one thing that I want to maybe follow up on is the idea of the check steps. and the topicality and locality and historicity of sounds. Put yourself in the shoes of the person who walks into the soundboard and says, okay, those are Czech sounds. What makes them recognizable? How, what's the specific historicity or topicality of sounds?
For me, it's actually really hard to pinpoint. And actually, I'm not that sure that I would agree with the listener. Or I have this idea how I think Czech film sounds, but I don't think it's very clear, or very clear is not the right word. I'm not sure it's very true what I think, because I have this idea that Czech film sounds ever since the 60s has been defined by very strange and very apt sound effects, meaning post-production effects, meaning echoes, hall plates, magnetic tape being played in reverse, which is obviously true, but that's not specific only for Czech cinema. That's how the cinematic landscape or soundscape was constructed back then, 60s, 70s. And but when we heard the composition in this space, in this venue, there might be something. What was really clear to me, or what I figured out, or what didn't occur to me before, was when we worked on the composition, or where Sara worked on the composition. I was listening to the dubbing tapes and comparing them to the films, and after a couple of minutes, you realize that most of the Foley that was recorded for the films didn't actually make the cut. They're not in the film, or they're not in the mix. There might be in the film, but they're so low in the mix that they didn't survive the transfer to the optical materials. But then you listen to the Foley tape and you hear that behind the music and the people, that there is a person running, there's still the steps. So it then was up to the sound engineer who was creating the language version, if they want to include the Foley that was sort of neglected in the original mix, which is a very strange realization for me, because I kind of felt that that's what's sort of specific about part of Czech cinema history, is the lack of Foley, that very intense moments happen without Foley, that they happen in this very weird sonic vacuum where you have only dialogue, music, and echoes of the dialogue and echoes of the music, and the Foley is very sparse and very, very eerie, which I don't know what to conclude from that. I only can conclude that the Foley was recorded, and for some reason, somebody, probably the sound engineer, maybe the composer, maybe the director, decided, okay, let's skip those particular steps or cutlery or whatsoever. But I don't know if there is anything in the quality of the sound itself, maybe the mix, but I wouldn't be sure. Meaning the EQ of the Foley, I wouldn't be really sure that there is anything specific about the quality of the sound itself that makes it Czech.
Just to add to that, it just occurred to me, sometimes dubbing tracks are actually done after the film has been released, so it could be, it could also be that, but do you want?
Yeah, for example, in the 70s and 80s in Germany, but maybe it can help. The dubbing was made in one room, and the Foley was also in the room to make all the body noises. So that might be kind of like this poltergeist in the room as well.
I'm not sure if we can be as taxative as saying like this sounds like Czech cinema, this sounds like German cinema. I don't know if if it's that even different. I think in relation to other things, like the kind of technological traces. Sonia, are you there? The technological traces, the acoustics of the acoustic treatment of the sound effects, the kind of music chosen to. So maybe in relation to sounds, for instance, holding from Murray Schaffer's idea of sound marking a soundscape. A sound mark is not necessarily one sound, but a relationship between many factors, acoustics included, right? So, but again, like we've been around this material and around having conversations about this for quite some time now, and doing the 30 minutes for the listening bar helped us concretizing some sort of idea, one possible approach of this material. At this point, it's like about raising the questions and without actually, you know, like the question is there a Czech specific quality in this archive? Asking a year. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I started the discussion under the assumption that sound was mimetic, that film sound was mimetic, that it would represent real objects. And what's fascinating about your work, Simone, is that you managed to sort of go against the materiality of objects or repurpose material objects and make them sound like something else. And that's a wonderful effect when you see the sound source, to discover that it's actually a sound coming from something that does not at all look like the purported sound source on screen. And that already shows you that even in the mimetic approach to sound, there's an imaginary component, and that you can invent sounds, and that you do invent sonic environments when you compose image and sound. Barbara Flückiger, I mean, you're absolutely right, Sara. It's not like film studies hasn't paid attention to sound over the last 30 years, but it bears repeating. I mean, I think there still needs to be more work done. One of the scholars who's contributed in important ways to the study of sound is Barbara Flückiger, and she came up with this wonderful concept of the unidentified sound object, or unidentifizierbares Klangobjekt, the UCO, you know, analogous to the UFO, and basically it's something that she says starts appearing particularly in Hollywood films of the 1970s, where suddenly you have these surround sound situations, and in films like Star Wars, there are all kinds of sounds that have absolutely no correlative in the lived world of the audience. And it's not just the sound of the lightsaber, which of course has become sort of a brand sound. And when you hear that, there's only one object that you can think of, which is the lightsaber in Star Wars. That's, for instance, not a transferable sound. So it's actually sort of more of an imaginary than a mimetic space that we're working in.
Yeah, I just want to go with that and talk more about authorship of Foley, because Foley is a collaborative work. There's not only one Foley, there's a Foley editor, a mixer. So that's a problem also in archiving this work, because it's not this kind of like this one auteur in it. And with that, it's about the authorship, about noise. And for instance, in the present in Germany, also in the audio play world, you have kind of like an authorship, which effect you're using on stage, because for example, Jörg Klinkenberg, he has its own style. So in a discussion about Czech steps, I would more ask about who's the person who've done these steps, because of course when I'm working, or if you're working, it's my body that I'm using. I'm feeling into it. I'm performing something, but I also have some my own style in it. And for me, that's kind of like the important discussion also in mentorship. Okay, you learn something from someone, you listened on TikTok, for example, and then this is the knowledge you have on it. So my question also is about, okay, what are you doing with the authorships of those sounds?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a great question to raise as well. So in our case, in not only the Foley archive, but like, let's say the context of sound history of Czech cinema, for most of the films, we wouldn't know the Foley artist. For most of the film, what you would know would be the sound engineer, meaning the usually the guy who made the mix. Every once in a while, you have a note in the production materials or in the opening or ending credits of the film of this role called sound effects, which usually means Foley, but not really all the time. It's more complicated than that. But you don't have this role for all of the films. It's only in I don't know the percentage, but now. But like, even if you have sound effects, it's usually the guy who would be recording the Foley, not really the people actually doing the sounds themselves. That's the first part of this issue, that we actually don't know the authors. for most of the films. And on the other part of this debate is the fact that as far as Czech copyright law is concerned, Foley is not considered a work of art, or because it doesn't create this. There's this fiction of not being repeatable, or this idea that constitutes a work of art in terms of in the eyes of the copyright law, that the work has to be unique. It has to be not repeatable. And as far as we know, or our lawyers think, this is not true for Foley. This is the law views it as it's a technical profession. It's making sounds.
Yeah, that would seem to prove my initial point, but then creating a connection is already a creative act, and that's where you where the authorship comes in, and where you have an.
And I think, I'm not sure, but please just correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what Simone is trying to say is that, and that's also, for instance, I've been trying to put forward the awareness that sound design is not music. Sound design is deciding how the footsteps sound and what kind of acoustics you print in your soundtrack, in your integrated soundtrack. So I don't know how I relate to authorship, but I understand that you are trying to bring attention to the fact that every sound element of the integrated soundtrack has an aesthetic value that comes from your active choice. That it's not again, and also like it would be good to expand an understanding of Foley beyond footsteps, because it's not just footsteps. But again, a footstep is not just a footstep. It implies the clothing, it implies so many other things. And then the job of the sound designer is to make some cohesive, I would hope, relationship between all these different elements, the ambiances, the Foley, the music, the dialogues. For instance, you do have a very specific aesthetic print in French Nouvelle Vague. You listen to a French Nouvelle Vague film and you know it's dated. You know that's how it sounded in that period, right? So that's also sound design, I guess.
Certainly also goes for any soundtrack made by Godard. We already have a question from the audience. Tom Simmer, please. And more questions back there. Yeah. I saw Tom first, and then Pavita will be next.
Hi, thanks so much for a wonderful panel. So I was wondering about how much Foley or noise recording is affected by larger, let's say, maybe ideological shifts in film industries. For example, like with the example of the rubber gloves, also had to think about the sound of gunshots, that I guess everybody here knows how a gunshot should sound, which is probably far away from how an actual gunshot sounds, probably, at least I think, because we saw so many films with gunshots, which were produced by Foley artists, and this certain hyper-reality aspect of this element of production is, if I look at now, for example, what happened to dialogue in German films or in English-speaking films in a lot of countries in the last years, that dialogue shifted towards a performance of more naturalness, like not talking like on stage, but going into direction of mumblecore, talking like actual people talk to each other. So is there shifts like that going on in or affecting your work, actually? Thank you.
There is, for example, if you're thinking about after the First World War, if you're thinking about, 1910s, 1920s, people were traumatized by, for example, large noises and guns. And so if there's, for example, you can see it or listen to it in Nothing New on the Western Front, for example, if you compare those films with the sound design of 2021, which was also I think it got the Academy Award for it. You have this
this huge the differences in the nuance. What is noise, and what should noise transport into the scenery, and should it provoke or make you kind of like dizzy that you don't know where you are, like the protagonist itself. I always like to show, for example, the gunshot is something really nice, because in the audio plays in the beginning they tried to shoot it. They had guns for it, and later on you just layer it. And if I'm doing it live, I'm using kind of like just a linear and also kind of like a small box, and you slap it really good. Oh, okay, so no, don't say something like that. But it's kind of like how you present it, and you can trace a noise. For example, slaps, something fights, for example, they changed with Fight Club, where you layer everything, and before that you just use this one chuck. And you also see it in the Foley scripts themselves. It's just chuck, and now it's getting more complex in it.
We have time for Pavitra's question. As you will find out, there is such a thing as free lunch, and it will be served at SİNEMA TRANSTOPIA at 1:30, right after we... No. Right after Pavitra asks her question, gets an answer, and then we all rush over to SİNEMA TRANSTOPIA.
That's actually a rule in filmmaking, that you cannot talk about lunch when we're shooting films, because the crew will just want to go eat.
Okay.
So that's
all
us
right.
now.
I'm very sorry to be keeping you from lunch.
Didn't want to put any pressure on you.
No, really. No, it's less a question and more a sort of comment that I'm glad we moved from thinking about sound as generic and mimetic to the notion of imaginary space. Because one of the things I was thinking as I was listening to your wonderful talks was that I have been taught how to listen because of the work of sound designers and Foley artists. So, for instance, in 70s Hindi cinema, right, like the notion that is a or a dishum sound is a particular thing. It's the sound of gunshots or punches. I have learned to listen in that way. And so it seems to me that your work is doing is pedagogical in a sense. It's teaching me, it's creative, but it's also teaching me to make certain associations between sound and image, but also between sound and sound. And I wonder if that sounds right to you, that formulation of your work.
Thank you for your comment and your question. That's something that I'm very interested in. I think it relates to your question too. There's some things that we've learned to listen to because of film. Some of them wrongly. Some of them have been actually miseducating us or building expectations that are not accurate. But on the other hand, I do agree with you, and especially, we were actually discussing this yesterday. There's a certain reading that might be geographically based on how you like a scene to sound like. And for instance, you mentioning fight scenes, like, after Rocky and Raging Bull, like all punches sound the same, but actually you cannot deviate from that because the audience will not believe you if you don't do it the way that has been done for 50 years. I think it's interesting to challenge that. My biggest challenge as a sound designer actually is regarding music. I usually, if I have like a struggle with the directors or the producers, is because I'm trying to push less music in the film. But there's definitely and for instance, in some scenes, it's like, okay, this needs music because I've been taught to see these kind of moments within that approach. So I think it's nice to. I think it's a beautiful thing of like a well-established language that works because it has been working like that for very long, and then in certain aspects to challenge that and to try to go a different way, maybe more. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the idea of like being pedagogic in sound design, but yeah, maybe maybe actually challenging our sound education.
Yeah, I just want to quickly comment on that. I think this is a topic that is sort of floating around between the panels, and all the panels, the question of how abstract and how concrete sound can be or sound is. And I think you made a really great point, not only with the relation between the sound and the picture and the sound and the sound, because as Foley works shows us, we are talking about steps, but if you use steps and you use it in a different context, different sonic context, they might not be perceived as steps anymore. There might be perceived as rain, or if you chop them up, there might be, I don't know, slamming doors or whatever. Context is always the key in this sort of situations. And obviously we are hardwired to perceive certain sounds in a certain way, but in the context of sound design and filmic sound design, I think what we are learning more and more is the sounds themselves are actually really, really abstract. It's really, and it's also the question of how to identify them, because for a human ear, it's very hard to identify particular sounds, and that's why where AI might come in. That's a different debate, but like it's a viable take, I think. But you can actually see and hear that the sounds themselves might be really more abstract than we actually think.
Before AI comes in, actually, I think that's where concrete music or acousmatic practices can be very informative for a film sound. And as like an end note, because I could talk about sound like for, a little bit longer, but as an end note, I would, because the composition will be, I wouldn't think of it as a composition, but the composition will be available online, and I would like to challenge any of you to find the chicken that becomes a cat in the third version. Because that's the thing, like when you start looking at the sounds by their spectral information, and you see the gesture and the texture in it, anything can be everything.
Speaking of chickens and cats,
no, please. Let's eat them.
Lunch is ready over at SİNEMA TRANSTOPIA. Don't tumble over each other. There's enough food to go around. See you over in SİNEMA TRANSTOPIA.